and non-believers. This is Rabbit Ape. A Christian once pointed out to me that humans and bananas have 60% of their DNA in common, and then jokingly asked whether it meant we are related. Well, yes, that is exactly what it means. First of all, you need to understand something. All life on Earth is based on DNA. Sometimes people think of DNA as a blueprint for building a body. This can be a useful metaphor, but it is more correct to say that DNA is a recipe for building a body. It is a set of instructions for folding proteins into a living, growing organism, rather than a map that explicitly states the leg bone is connected to the hip bone is connected to the backbone, etc. All life forms use the same 4 bases as information carriers in their DNA structure: adenosine, guanine, thymine, and cytosine. Forgive my pronunciation, but we can shorten those to A, G, T, and C. The genetic information that defines every single life form that we know of, animals, plants, fungi, bacteria, you name it, the genetic information that defines every life form is nothing more than a very long string of characters written in this 4-letter alphabet. This at least suggests that all life forms are related, because there's no good reason why independently emerging life would all use the exact same system and the exact same base pairs. Of course, you could say that God, having invented the AGTC-based DNA system, decided to use it for all the millions of different life forms without creating even one with a genetic matrix based on a different molecule. Not very imaginative, especially for a god, but it is conceivable. Moving on. For our purposes here, let's define a gene as a section of the entire genetic code. Certain characteristics can be traced to specific genes, so it can be useful for us to say things like genes for longer legs or the gene for sickle cell anemia. Just keep in mind, again, that the DNA is not a literal description of the body. Brown hair, blue eyes, 5'8", with a tendency towards skepticism. It's an incredibly complex process mapped out by thousands, if not millions, of different genes interacting with each other in complex ways that hopefully produce a viable organism, the purpose of which is to propagate the genes that built it. Now, as it turns out, different life forms use many of the same gene sequences for the same or similar purposes. The same gene that codes for segments in flies codes for rib growth in mice. This seems to indicate that they both inherited that gene from a common ancestor. What, you might ask, was the last common ancestor of vertebrates and arthropods? Probably a worm-like creature in an early Cambrian sea. In any case, the genetic similarities seem to increase along with perceived relationship. For instance, humans and chimpanzees have more than 95% and perhaps as much as 98.5% of their DNA in common. At this point, you might be tempted to pull a Kirk Cameron and say that the similarities are there not because we share a common ancestor, but because we have the same designer. But there's more to it than mere similarity. You see, there are these tiny parasitic molecular machines called viruses. You can't exactly call them alive. They're more like rogue body parts of cells. A virus consists of some DNA or RNA and a protein shell. The shell serves to hook onto a living cell and inject the viral DNA. The viral DNA then breaks down the cell's own genetic material and uses the A, G, T, and C to copy itself a few thousand times, after which the assembler code of the viral DNA builds new protein shells. The cell then breaks down and the new viruses are released. Some viruses don't do that. Retroviruses enter the cell like a normal virus, but then the parasitic genes interweave themselves with the host's DNA, sneaking in like a spy in a row of soldiers. Then it waits. Every time the cell divides a copy is made of the new DNA until a certain moment or event triggers the virus and the cell dies in the birth of an army of replicated viruses. Now, sometimes something goes wrong. Sometimes the virus never activates and instead becomes a permanent part of the host's DNA. If you know where to look, you can use these foreign DNA sequences as markers. If your father possessed such retroviral DNA remnants, you would have them too, as would your children. It doesn't happen very often, and that's exactly what makes retroviruses so important to tracing human ancestry. You see, humans and chimpanzees have retroviral DNA sequence remnants in common. Several of them, in fact. And that means that humans and chimpanzees must have had a common ancestor. Chimps and humans also each have retroviral sequences that the other species does not. This means that they were acquired after humans and chimps split off. The rate at which new retroviruses are sustained has actually been more or less figured out. It is sometimes known as the molecular clock. Using this, it has been estimated with reasonable accuracy that humans and chimpanzees were one species a little over 5 million years ago. The fact that this notion is supported by a large car trunk full of ancestral primate fossils is just icing on the cake. That humans are descended from ape-like primates is not seriously in question and has not been for some time now. Now you might ask, how is this possible? If all life on Earth originated from a common ancestor, how did it come to exist in all the different forms that we see today? Where does the new genetic information come from? Well, first of all, remember once again that all life forms are built according to their DNA recipe. DNA contains such an enormous number of chemical connections that it is inevitable that some alterations will be caused by reactive chemicals or radiation. If such a chemical change occurs, it is usually corrected by the self-adjusting nature of DNA. However, every now and then, a change is permanent. It might not affect the cell, but when it does, the cell usually either dies or is destroyed by other cells. Sometimes neither happens. Sometimes a cell will survive with a permanently altered DNA sequence. Sometimes that cell is a reproductive cell, a sperm or an egg. If that reproductive cell goes on to become a new organism, every cell in the new organism will possess the altered DNA. The shift of a single atom can alter a base pair, which changes the entire gene, which affects other genes, which will affect other genes in turn. And that is a mutation. On average, every person has 4 mutations that were not present in either parent. Even so, the individual is almost never what one would call a mutant or a monster. The vast majority of mutations will either prevent the embryo from properly developing in the first place, or have no discernible effect whatsoever. But sometimes, just sometimes, the change will be profound, even if it is on a small scale. The stomach acid might be slightly different. The organism might have stronger bones, or more brittle ones. Or maybe they'll have more muscle tissue. Such a change could very well cause them to have more or fewer offspring. Odds are, at least half of those offspring will inherit the mutated gene. If the gene is recessive, they might not express the mutated trait, but they will still be carrying the mutated gene and will be able to pass it on to their offspring. If the mutation does benefit those who express it, it will have a tendency to become more and more widespread in the population. Of course, if circumstances change, that same mutation could become a disadvantage. If a creature had thicker fur than the average member of its species, it would have an advantage when it was cold, but be at a disadvantage if the climate warms up. And this is why variation is so important. The more variation exists within a species, the more likely it is to be able to adapt to changing circumstances. Along with variation, large numbers of offspring are also important. Almost every species in nature, mammals less so, produce far more offspring than can possibly survive long enough to reproduce. The random shuffling of genes that occurs every time a new reproductive cell is formed results in a unique combination of genes in every individual, helping to ensure that no matter what the circumstances, at least some offspring might survive to breed and pass on those genes to the next generation. The ones that survive will tend to be the ones with the most effective collections of genes. So, under stable circumstances, a species would remain more or less the same as long as the environment did, perhaps becoming better and better adapted to that specific situation. Such a species, however, would be vulnerable to rapidly changing conditions. Now I'm going to change gears for a second here. As much as I hate to even say these words out of fear of validating them, I need to bring up this whole microevolution versus macroevolution thing. Microevolution is supposed to be basically evolution on a small scale. Longer or shorter legs, a change of color pattern, or a shift in diet. Macroevolution is supposed to be bigger changes, like reptiles changing into birds or monkeys evolving into people. Here's the thing. Nobody distinguishes between microevolution and macroevolution, except to say they don't believe in macroevolution. The reason you'll never hear a real scientist bring this up is because it is understood that there is no such thing as microevolution or macroevolution. There's just evolution, which has been going on for the past 3 billion years or so of the Earth's 4.5 billion year existence. Microevolution might happen over the course of several years or several hundred years, such as a new breed of dog or bacteria becoming immune to antibiotics. The more drastic changes associated with macroevolution occur through the exact same mechanism, but happen over the course of thousands, if not millions or billions of years. It is interesting to note that most people who reject macroevolution also happen to think that the Earth is less than 10,000 years old. That's a whole other discussion. So anyway, on to human evolution. Just why primates split off a branch which evolved bipedalism, which is walking on 2 feet, about 5 million years ago, it's not yet clear. Climate change is usually considered the most likely cause, with the gradual desiccation of forests and the emergence of large plains benefiting walking upright over a semi-quadrupedal stance, which was specialized for tree climbing. In any case, the first step from a fairly chimpanzee-like ancestor to modern humans was probably walking upright, or at least walking exclusively on the hind limbs, which would free up the hands to manipulate the environment. The next step appears to have been a change of diet, from herbivorous to omnivorous. Eating meat, a rich source of protein, allows a double parallel development, which would be the reduction of the intestinal tract along with an increase in brain size. Once we had gotten this far, the first species in the genus Homo had emerged, Homo habilis, which was about 2 million years ago. Homo erectus, its much larger descendant, which was slightly smaller than us, fanned out over Asia and Europe from Africa, apparently parenting the Neanderthals in Europe and the Homo floresiensis in Asia. Finally, about 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens arose from Homo erectus in Africa, and about 140,000 years later followed the footsteps of Homo erectus, eventually populating the world, taming livestock, cultivating crops, building cities, and inventing gods. The genetic evidence is clear in suggesting all of this. So is the fossil record, which I should make a whole other video about, but if there's one thing you need to understand about fossils, it's this. The formation of a fossil, especially a complete skeleton, is an extraordinarily improbable event. The conditions have to be just right for it to happen. The vast majority of animals do not leave fossils behind. If you think they do, please show me the fossils of a talking snake, a giant, a fire-breathing dragon, Judas Iscariot, and the cat you buried in your backyard when you were in the 2nd grade. Personally, I find it infinitely grander to realize that I am part of a gigantic tapestry of life, rolling from its beginnings billions of years ago in the blazing furnace of a dying star. What evidence do you have, other than your magical book of fairy tales, that suggests our most distant ancestor was made from dirt 6,000 years ago?